It's probably one of the greatest thrills known to man, to tumble, glide and soar through the air, pushing a plane to the very edge of its capabilities. This particular pilot was responsible for stretching virtually every American combat plane to the limit during the war. But these efforts, and those of many others, were ignored when the history books were finally written.
In a man's world, if you have things that are yours, that are masculine, maybe you don't want the women to be able to do it.
Almost unnoticed, thousands of women from America, Russia, Germany and Britain took to the skies to help the war effort.
They said, "This is your pilot, Colonel." And the Colonel looked down at me very amused and said, "Good God, you know, we've got schoolgirls flying now, have we?"
I loved the Messerschmitt 109. She was difficult to fly because she tended to break out. When you took off, you had to really hold her. But once she was in the air, she was a wonderful, beautiful plane.
Once during Christmas, we dropped a bomb right on the spot where the Germans were taking a bath. They jumped out and shouted, "Rusky night witches." We just kept bombing them, and from that moment, the Germans were scared of us.
Many of these women would later die for their country, and their story was all but buried with them. It began in the skies above England in the late summer of 1940. Daily, more than 1,000 bombers and fighters of Hermann Goering's Luftwaffe launched wave after wave of attacks on London and Britain's southern air defences, preparing the way for a German invasion. During this Battle of Britain, a Royal Air Force pilot's life expectancy was just 6 weeks. The Spitfires and Hurricanes could be replaced, but there weren't enough men to fight in them, let alone fly the planes from the factories to the bases where they were needed. But there was a solution.
But to keep the Royal Air Force on the offensive, hundreds of aircraft must be flown each day between the factories, the maintenance depots and the aerodromes. The RAF can't take on the job. They're too busy on active service. It's done for them by the ATA.
The introduction of women into the ATA was the work of Britain's first female commercial pilot, Pauline Gower. But despite the shortage of pilots, Gower faced opposition from the very beginning.
She had rather a job, of course, convincing the men. And when they finally agreed, they chose only the very experienced pilots. And they were the first 8 women, who were mostly socialites or millionaires or that sort of thing. And they joined the ATA, and then she had to get a few more women in. And I was number 15. So we were all terribly keen now, thrilled to bits that there was a war. And when I joined, I was 5'1½". At the end, I was 5'3½". But after I joined, they made a rule that you had to be 5'6", because flying American Mustangs and bigger aircraft, you know, you couldn't reach. Well, what I used to do is I couldn't strap myself in because I put all the logbooks at the back of me to push me forward, so I didn't really have any difficulty, except I couldn't strap myself in. Hoped I didn't crash.
With the Battle of Britain at its height, the women acted as ambulance pilots in addition to ferrying planes from the factories. But when this propaganda film was made, the Battle of Britain was already over. Before this, those in authority had decided to keep their existence a secret from the enemy.
Hello. How about your Hurricane? You'll send a time for it?
Right, I will.
The British government said they didn't want the Germans to know that they were so desperately in need of pilots that they had to call on the women. And if that's not a put down, ask me another.
I suppose you know where the balloons are.
Well, we did up till yesterday.
If the propaganda films were less than complimentary to female intelligence, the women faced even greater derision from their male colleagues.
I think it's absolutely disgusting. It really is. I mean, they try to belittle us. They try to embarrass us and put us down, and all they can think of us is fluffy skirts and sitting in the cockpit and putting your lipstick and powder and all that on. They didn't like us really at all. They accepted us, But they didn't like to think that they were big and looked very impressive like pilots, and we were silly little women, you know, going in doing exactly the same job. And we had less accidents than the men, and I don't think they liked that. And then they didn't like the fact that apparently we ferried more aeroplanes than they did. They didn't like that. And, but on the whole, they put up with us, and they all tried very hard to, you know, sounds awful to say it on television, but to get into bed with everybody if they could.
Newspapers depicted women pilots as sex objects, playing at a job that only men could take seriously.
Got caught with your flaps down, so to speak. With the ATA any hour between 0900 and 1600.
And some male egos couldn't stand the idea of female flyers in any capacity. The editor of Aeroplane magazine wrote at the time,
"We quite agree that there are millions of women in the country who could do useful jobs in war. But the trouble is that so many of them insist on wanting to do jobs which they are quite incapable of doing. The menace is the woman who thinks that she ought to be flying a high-speed bomber when she really has not the intelligence to scrub the floor of a hospital properly."